You work harder than anyone around you, yet watch others with half your talent rise to positions you deserve. Every promotion goes to someone who seems to play the game better, while your dedication and results go unnoticed, leaving you frustrated and questioning if merit truly matters in today's world. I am Napoleon Bonaparte, and I rose from a minor Corsican artillery officer to Emperor of France, commanding armies that conquered most of Europe. What I discovered about seizing power and becoming unstoppable will transform how you approach every challenge in your life, using the same principles that built an empire from nothing. The battlefield may have changed from 18th century Europe to modern offices and boardrooms, but the laws of power, influence, and unstoppable momentum remain as relevant today as they were when I commanded the Grande Armée. But first, like this video, subscribe for more imperial wisdom and comment. Below where you're watching from, I want to know which corner of the world is ready to learn the laws of unstoppable success. Let me tell you something most people don't know about me. I wasn't born to rule an empire. I was born on a small island that had just been sold to France, the second son of a minor noble family that was barely scraping by. My father, Charles, was a lawyer who spent more time chasing political connections than building wealth, and my mother, Letizia, was constantly worried about feeding 8 children on our meager income. When I was 9 years old, my father secured me a scholarship to military school in mainland France. I remember the day I left Corsica, my mother's tears, my father's stern advice to make something of myself, and my own terror at leaving everything familiar behind. I spoke French with a thick Corsican accent that made me sound like a provincial. Peasant to my aristocratic classmates at the École Militaire in Brienne, I was an outsider from day one. The other boys came from wealthy French families with centuries of noble blood. They had tailored uniforms while mine was patched and re-sewn. They received packages of sweets and money from home while I survived on the basic school rations. They mocked my accent, called me the Corsican, and made it clear I didn't belong in their world. But here's what I learned during those brutal years of isolation. When the world tells you that you don't belong, you have 2 choices: accept their judgment or prove them so spectacularly wrong that they're forced to rewrite their opinions. I chose the second path. I threw myself into my studies with an obsession that bordered on madness. While my classmates played games and gossiped about court politics, I devoured every military history book I could find. I studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Frederick the Great until I could recite their strategies from memory. I learned that knowledge was the great equalizer. No one could take away what I had learned, regardless of my background or accent. My mathematics and geography scores were exceptional, but it was my strategic thinking that truly set me apart. During war game exercises, I would spend hours analyzing terrain maps, calculating angles of attack, and predicting enemy movements. My instructors began to notice that this strange Corsican boy had an intuitive understanding of military strategy that couldn't be taught. The entrance exam to the École Militaire in Paris was my first real test. I knew this exam would determine whether I remained a provincial curiosity or gained access to the French military establishment. I prepared for months, reviewing every mathematical principle, every historical battle, every geographic detail I had learned. When the results were announced, I had placed 42nd out of 137 candidates, high enough to secure my place, but more importantly, high enough to prove that merit could overcome background. That exam score was my first victory against a system designed to keep people like me in their place. At the École Militaire in Paris, I encountered an even more refined level of aristocratic privilege, but I was no longer the intimidated boy. From Corsica, I had learned to channel my outsider status into fuel for excellence. While others relied on their family connections, I built my reputation on competence and results. I graduated as a second lieutenant in the artillery, a technical branch that valued mathematical skill over social connections. It was the perfect place for someone who needed to prove himself through performance rather than pedigree. I was 16 years old, commissioned as an officer in the French army, and absolutely determined to climb higher than anyone thought possible. That commission represented more than just a military rank. It was proof that the old rules could be broken by those willing to outwork, outstudy, and outthink their competition. My real education began not in the classrooms of Paris, but in the muddy trenches and smoky battlefields where incompetent officers sent good men to die for their own vanity. As a young artillery officer, I watched in horror as generals who had earned their positions through birthright rather than ability made decision after catastrophic decision. The French Revolution had turned the world upside down, and by 1793 I found myself stationed in the port city of Toulon, which had fallen to British and Spanish forces. The siege had been dragging on for months under the command of officers who treated warfare like a gentleman's game rather than a deadly serious contest of wills and intellect. I was 24 years old, a captain of artillery, and growing increasingly frustrated watching senior officers repeat the same failed tactics day after day. They would position cannons according to textbook formations, attack at predictable times, and retreat when the enemy showed any serious resistance. It was military theater, not military strategy. During one particularly disastrous council of war, I watched General Carteau, a former house painter turned revolutionary general, propose yet another frontal assault that would accomplish nothing except filling more graves. I couldn't remain silent any longer. I stood up in that tent filled with men who outranked me and presented an alternative strategy that no one had considered. Instead of attacking the fortified positions directly, I proposed we seize the high ground at Point Leguillette and position our artillery to command the entire harbor. From that position, we could make it impossible for British ships to remain in port, forcing them to withdraw and leaving the Spanish garrison isolated and vulnerable. The silence in that tent was deafening. Here was a young Corsican captain telling seasoned generals that their entire approach was wrong. Some looked offended, others curious, but I could see in their eyes that they knew I was right. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity: control the key terrain, make the enemy's position untenable, and victory becomes inevitable. What happened next changed the trajectory of my entire life. The representatives from Paris, desperate for any solution that might work, gave me permission to implement my strategy. I was effectively given command of the artillery and the authority to position guns according to my plan rather than conventional wisdom. I spent the next 3 days personally sighting every cannon, calculating angles of fire, and coordinating with infantry commanders who were initially skeptical of taking orders from someone half their age. But I had learned something. Crucial during those years of study, confidence based on competence is irresistible. When you know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it, others naturally follow your lead. On December 17, 1793, we launched the assault on Point Leguillette. I personally commanded the battery that broke through the enemy lines, taking grape shot in my leg, but refusing to leave my position until the objective was secured. Within hours, our cannons dominated the harbor, and within days, the British fleet was evacuating under fire. Toulon fell in a matter of days after months of futile siege. The victory was so decisive and unexpected that it sent shockwaves through the military establishment. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about the young artillery officer who had accomplished what his superiors could not. But here's what that victory taught me about the nature of opportunity and leadership. Most people in positions of authority are there by accident, not design. They're following outdated playbooks and conventional wisdom that may have worked in the past, but is completely inadequate for current challenges. When you can see a better way and have the courage to speak up, the world is desperate to follow someone who actually knows what they're doing. The promotion to brigadier general came immediately. At 24, I was the youngest general in French history, but more importantly, I had learned that merit and results could overcome any disadvantage, of birth or background. I had also learned that in chaos, the person with the clearest vision and the boldest plan doesn't just survive, they thrive. That night, writing my report by candlelight in a tent still reeking of gunpowder, I realized that I was no longer thinking like a follower waiting for orders. I was thinking like a leader who creates opportunities rather than waiting for them to appear. The boy from Corsica was dead. In his place stood someone who understood that the world belongs to those who can see what others cannot and act while others hesitate. The first law that will make you unstoppable is this: every opportunity that crosses your path is a test of your character, and most people fail this test because they're waiting for perfect conditions that will never come. After my victory at Toulon, I was riding high as the youngest general in French history. But then the political winds shifted. Robespierre fell, the terror ended, and suddenly my revolutionary connections became liabilities. I was stripped of my command, investigated for treason, and found myself unemployed and nearly penniless in Paris. For months, I wandered the streets of the capital, my uniform growing shabby, my boots wearing thin, watching lesser men occupy positions I deserved. I could have returned to Corsica, accepted a minor posting in some provincial garrison, or found work as a civilian. Many of my former colleagues did exactly that, choosing security over the uncertainty of waiting for their next chance. But I had learned something crucial at Toulon. Opportunity rarely announces itself with fanfare. It usually arrives disguised as a problem that everyone else is trying to avoid. In October 1795, that disguised opportunity came in the form of royalist insurgents threatening to overthrow the Directory. Paris was in chaos. The government was paralyzed, and someone needed to defend the Tuileries Palace against thousands of armed rebels. It was a suicide mission that could end a career as easily as it could make one. Paul Barras, one of the Directory leaders, was desperately seeking a general who could organize the defense. Most senior officers found excuses to be elsewhere. The situation was too volatile, the politics too uncertain, the risks too great. They were waiting for a safer opportunity, a clearer path to advancement. I saw exactly what they saw: the danger, the uncertainty, the very real possibility of failure. But I also saw what they missed, that in moments of crisis, the person who steps forward when others step back doesn't just solve the immediate problem, they position themselves to benefit. From everything that follows, I sought out Barras immediately and volunteered to defend the government. Not because I loved the Directory, but because I understood that this chaos represented the perfect opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities to the people who would shape France's future. When everyone else was paralyzed by uncertainty, I was energized by possibility. The Royalist attack came on October 5th. I had positioned cannons at every strategic point around the Tuileries, loaded with grapeshot and manned by gunners who trusted my tactical judgment. When the rebels charged, expecting to overwhelm a demoralized government, they instead ran into carefully planned fields of fire that cut them down by the hundreds. The whiff of grapeshot, as I later called it, ended the Royalist threat in a single afternoon. But more importantly, it established me as the man who saved the Directory when no one else would take the risk. Within weeks, I was back in favor, back in command, and being considered for major campaigns. The same politicians who had ignored me when I was unemployed now competed for my attention. The opportunity that others had seen as too dangerous, I had recognized as too valuable to miss. This is what I mean about seizing opportunity like your. Life depends on it because it does. Every moment when you choose safety over possibility, you're choosing to remain exactly where you are. Every time you wait for better conditions, you're allowing someone else to claim the prize you could have won. Most people treat opportunities like they treat rare wines, something to be saved for a special occasion that never comes. I learned to treat them like fresh bread, something that loses its value quickly and must be consumed while it's still warm. The Italian campaign that followed was the direct result of my willingness to risk everything defending the Directory. That campaign made me famous across Europe and set the stage for everything that followed, all because I understood that opportunity is not a gift, it's a test, and the prize goes to whoever is bold enough to take the test while others are still reading the questions. Your breakthrough is waiting for you right now, disguised as a problem that others are avoiding. The question is, will you recognize it and seize it, or will you wait for something safer to come along? People called me the luckiest general in Europe, but what they called luck was actually the result of preparation, so thorough that it bordered on obsession. I didn't get lucky. I created conditions where favorable outcomes became inevitable. When I took command of the Army of Italy in 1796, I inherited 30,000 demoralized, underfed, and poorly equipped soldiers facing a coalition of Austrian and Piedmontese forces that outnumbered us nearly 2-1. The conventional wisdom was that we were doomed to fight a defensive campaign, slowly retreating while hoping for reinforcements that would never come. Instead, I spent my first week doing something that amazed my staff officers. I studied, not just the enemy dispositions and troop strengths, which any competent general would examine, but everything that could possibly affect the outcome of our campaigns. I memorized the topography of every valley, the capacity of every bridge, the seasonal patterns of every river. I learned which roads became impassable after rain, which mountain passes could be traversed in winter, and which villages could supply provisions for a moving army. I interviewed local guides, studied weather patterns from previous years, and calculated marching times between every significant position. My staff thought I was wasting valuable time on irrelevant details. They wanted to focus on grand strategy and battle formations. But I had learned something crucial from my study of history's greatest commanders. Battles are won by generals who control variables that others ignore. When we finally began our offensive, what my enemies called impossible luck was actually the predictable result of superior information. When I appeared to move my army through impassable terrain, it was because I had spent weeks learning which paths the locals used during different seasons. When I seemed to anticipate enemy movements with supernatural accuracy, it was because I understood the geographical constraints that limited their options. At the Battle of Montenotte, the Austrians were shocked when my artillery appeared on heights they considered inaccessible. They called it miraculous timing, but I had spent days calculating exactly how long it would take to position guns on that ridge during different weather conditions. When the moment came, I knew precisely what was possible. The victory at Lodi became legendary because I personally sighted the cannons that broke the Austrian retreat across the Adda River. But that dramatic moment was possible only because I had studied the river crossings weeks in advance, identified the optimal firing positions, and calculated the exact angles needed to sweep the bridge with grapeshot. My soldiers began calling me Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal, because I knew details about terrain, supplies, and logistics that most generals left to their subordinates. While other commanders remained in their headquarters studying maps, I was walking the ground, talking to local farmers, and testing every assumption with my own eyes. This preparation created what others perceived as supernatural intuition. When I seemed to know exactly where the enemy would attack, it was because I had identified the limited number of viable approaches and positioned my forces accordingly. When I appeared to have unlimited supplies in hostile territory, it was because I had mapped every granary, every mill, and every hidden cache within 50 miles. The most famous example of my luck came during the Battle of Rivoli, when I arrived at the crucial moment with reinforcements that saved the day. The Austrians and even my own officers called it miraculous timing, but I had calculated days earlier exactly when and where the decisive battle would occur. I had positioned reserves within precise marching distances and prepared contingency orders for every possible scenario. What made this preparation different from mere diligence was its comprehensive nature. I didn't just study military factors, I studied everything that could influence outcomes. I learned about local politics, economic conditions, harvest schedules, and religious holidays. I understood that an army's morale could be affected by a rumor spreading through nearby villages, or that a campaign's timing could be determined by when farmers needed to bring in their crops. This obsessive preparation had a compound effect that my enemies never anticipated. Each small advantage, better maps, more accurate intelligence, superior logistics, combined with others to create overwhelming superiority. What looked like a series of lucky breaks was actually a system designed to generate favorable outcomes. The real secret was that I prepared not just for what I expected to happen, but for everything that could possibly happen. I had contingency, plans for scenarios that seemed ridiculous to my staff. I maintained supply lines for routes we might never use. I gathered intelligence about enemy commanders' personal habits and psychological weaknesses. By the time most people start preparing, the opportunity has already passed. True preparation begins long before you know what you're preparing for. It's the daily accumulation of knowledge, skills, and resources that puts you in position to capitalize when chance finally presents itself. Lucky people aren't born lucky. They create their own luck through preparation so thorough that success becomes inevitable. The third law that will make you unstoppable is this: people will follow you into hell if they see you leading the way, but they'll abandon you at the first sign of trouble if you're directing from safety. I learned this lesson not from military textbooks, but from watching my own soldiers' faces change when I stepped into the range of enemy fire alongside them. There's a moment, you can see it in their eyes, when men stop following orders and start following a leader. That moment only comes when you prove you're willing to share their risks. At the Battle of Lodi in 1796, we needed to cross a narrow bridge under heavy Austrian artillery fire. The bridge was barely wide enough for two cannons side by side, and the Austrians had positioned their guns to create a killing field that any sane person would avoid. My officers were discussing complex flanking maneuvers that would take hours we didn't have. I walked to the front of our artillery column, grabbed the rammer from a surprised gunner, and began helping to load and aim the cannons myself. Not because I was the best artilleryman in the army, I wasn't, but because my soldiers needed to see that their general was willing to do the most dangerous job on the battlefield. The effect was immediate and electric. Word spread through the ranks within minutes. Bonaparte is sighting the guns himself. Suddenly, every man in that battery was working with desperate precision, not because they feared my orders, but because they couldn't bear to let down a commander who was sharing their danger. We took that bridge in 30 minutes of the most intense artillery duel I've ever experienced. The Austrians retreated in such haste that we captured most of their equipment, but the real victory wasn't tactical, it was psychological. From that day forward, my soldiers knew they served a general who would never ask them to go where he wouldn't go first. This principle of frontline leadership became the foundation of everything I accomplished. During the Italian campaigns, I made it a point to be visible at the most dangerous moments. When we stormed the bridge at Arcole, I grabbed a battle flag and led the charge personally. When crossing the Alps seemed impossible, I walked beside my men through the mountain passes instead of riding. My enemies called this behavior reckless, a waste of valuable command talent. They argued that a general's life was too important to risk in common soldiers' work, but they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of leadership. A general who leads from behind may win battles, but he'll never inspire the kind of fanatical loyalty that wins wars. At Austerlitz, my greatest victory, the decisive moment came when I positioned myself with a forward artillery battery that broke the Allied center. My presence there wasn't necessary for tactical coordination. I had excellent subordinates who could have directed the fire. But my soldiers needed to see that their emperor was willing to stand in the place of greatest danger when everything depended on their performance. The psychological effect of visible leadership extends far beyond military situations. When people see their leader taking personal risks for shared goals, it transforms the entire dynamic of the organization. Orders become suggestions, hierarchy becomes partnership, and individual effort becomes collective mission. But here's what most people misunderstand about leading from the front. It's not about being reckless or putting yourself in unnecessary danger. It's about being visibly committed to the same standards and sacrifices you expect from others. It's about sharing the burden instead of just distributing it. During the retreat from Moscow, the darkest period of my career, I walked alongside my soldiers through the snow instead of riding in the few remaining carriages. I ate the same meager rations, slept in the same inadequate shelters, and endured the same brutal cold. Those men had every reason to abandon me. The campaign was lost. The army was disintegrating, and following me meant almost certain death. But thousands of them stayed loyal through that nightmare, because they had seen me share their suffering. For years, they knew I wasn't asking them to endure hardships I was unwilling to face myself. Even in defeat, they followed me because I had earned the right to lead through years of visible sacrifice. This principle applies to every aspect of leadership, not just dramatic battlefield moments. When I was managing the complex politics of conquered territories, I made sure to personally visit every region, meet with local leaders, and understand conditions on the ground. When I was reforming French law and administration, I attended countless meetings that other leaders would have delegated to subordinates. People can sense immediately whether their leader truly understands their challenges or is just issuing orders from a comfortable distance. They know the difference between someone who has earned authority through shared experience and someone who simply inherited it through position. The most powerful leaders in history, whether military, political, or business, have always understood this principle. They lead by example, not just by instruction. They earn loyalty through demonstrated commitment, not just through rank or title. If you want people to follow you into uncertainty, you must show them that you're willing to face that uncertainty first. If you want them to work harder, you must demonstrate your own work ethic. If you want them to take risks, you must prove that you're willing to take the biggest risks yourself. Leadership from the front isn't just about being brave, it's about being present, being visible, and being personally invested in the outcomes you're asking others to achieve. The fourth law that will make you unstoppable is learning to distinguish between urgency and impatience, knowing when to strike immediately and when to wait for the perfect moment, even if that waiting feels like agony. This is perhaps the hardest lesson I learned because my natural instinct was always to act. I was the general who moved faster than anyone expected, who struck before enemies could prepare, who built an empire through decisive action. But I also learned that some victories can only be achieved by those who have the discipline to wait. My brave exile on the island of Elba taught me this lesson in the most painful way possible. After my abdication in 1814, I found myself trapped on a tiny Mediterranean island, watching from a distance as the Bourbon monarchy and the Congress of Vienna dismantled everything I had built. Every instinct screamed at me to act immediately, to escape, to reclaim my throne before my enemies could consolidate their power. For months I paced the shores of Elba like a caged animal, plotting various schemes for immediate return. I could have attempted an escape within weeks of my arrival, when security was relatively lax and my supporters in France were still numerous. My impatience demanded action, but my strategic mind recognized that premature action would be suicide. Instead, I forced myself to wait and watch. I maintained correspondence with loyal followers throughout Europe, not to plan an immediate rebellion, but to understand the changing political situation. I learned that the restored Bourbon king was deeply unpopular, that the Congress of Vienna was making decisions that angered French pride, and that my veterans were being mistreated by the new regime. Most importantly, I waited for the right seasonal moment. A winter escape would mean crossing dangerous seas and arriving in France during the worst traveling weather. Spring would give me better conditions for movement and communication. Each month of delay was torture, but each month also improved. My odds of success, when I finally made my move in February 1815, it wasn't because my impatience overcame my judgment. It was because all conditions had aligned for maximum effectiveness. I had ships ready, loyal supporters positioned along my route, and detailed intelligence about French political conditions. The 100 days that followed proved that my strategic patience had been justified. But let me share an even more important example from my earlier career when strategic patience led to one of my greatest victories. Before the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, I faced a combined Austrian and Russian army that significantly outnumbered my forces. Every military convention suggested I should either retreat or seek immediate battle before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Instead, I chose to wait in an apparently weak position, deliberately making my army appear smaller and more vulnerable than it actually was. For days, I maintained this deception while my enemies grew more confident and careless. I could have attacked several times when tactical conditions were favorable, but I waited for the moment when strategic conditions would be perfect. The patience was agonizing. My marshals questioned my inaction, my soldiers grew restless, and my enemies interpreted my delay as weakness. Every day increased the risk that they would discover my true strength or receive additional reinforcements. But I had identified the exact conditions that would guarantee victory, and I refused to act until those conditions existed. When the Allies finally attacked on December 2nd, they did exactly what I had predicted they would do, moving exactly where I wanted them to move, at exactly the time I had chosen. The battle was decided not by what happened that day, but by my willingness to wait for the day when victory was inevitable. This kind of strategic patience requires a specific type of mental discipline that most people never develop. It means accepting short-term discomfort for long-term advantage. It means enduring criticism from people who can't see the larger picture. It means having the confidence to stick with your plan when everyone around you is demanding immediate action. The key is learning to distinguish between productive waiting and passive inaction. Strategic patience isn't about avoiding action. It's about timing action for maximum effect. You're still preparing, still positioning, still gathering resources and intelligence. You're just not revealing your hand until the moment when revelation guarantees success. In my business dealings as emperor, I applied this same principle to negotiations with other European powers. Instead of making immediate demands or showing all my cards at once, I would often wait months for the right moment to propose treaties or territorial exchanges. Patient timing often accomplished what military pressure could not. The mistake most people make is confusing activity with progress. They feel they must be constantly moving, constantly taking action, constantly pushing forward. But sometimes the most powerful action is the disciplined decision not to act until conditions are optimal. Your enemies and competitors are usually impatient. They want immediate results, quick victories, fast returns on their investments. This impatience becomes their weakness and your opportunity. While they exhaust themselves with premature efforts, you can wait for the moment when success becomes inevitable. True strategic patience isn't passive. It's the active choice to accumulate advantages until you can achieve decisive victory rather than incremental progress. It's the discipline to build overwhelming force before revealing your intentions. It's the wisdom to know that the right moment is worth more than any amount of effort applied at the wrong moment. The fifth law that will make you unstoppable is understanding that no empire, whether military, business, or personal, is ever built by one person alone. Your success depends entirely on your ability to make other powerful people invested in your victory. I learned this lesson early, but I learned it the hard way. As a young general drunk on my own tactical brilliance, I believed that superiors, strategy and personal charisma were enough to conquer Europe. I thought I could simply outfight and outthink my enemies until they submitted to my will. I was catastrophically wrong. My first real education in alliance building came during the Italian campaigns, when I realized that military victory was meaningless without political support. I could win every battle, capture every fortress, and scatter every enemy army, but if the politicians in Paris decided I was a threat, my victories would become irrelevant overnight. So I began treating my relationship with the Directory as carefully as I treated my military campaigns. I sent regular dispatches that emphasized not just my tactical successes, but how those successes served their political interests. I made sure that influential members of the government received their share of captured treasure. I positioned my victories as their victories, making them stakeholders in my continued success. But the most important alliance I built during this period wasn't with politicians. It was with my own soldiers. I made every man in my army feel personally invested in our shared success by ensuring that victory meant tangible benefits for everyone. After each successful campaign, I distributed captured wealth among the troops, promoted deserving officers, regardless of their social background, and made sure that stories of our achievements reached their families back home. My marriage to Josephine was itself a strategic alliance that taught me how personal relationships can serve larger purposes. Josephine was not just a beautiful woman, she was connected to the most influential social and political circles in Paris. Through her, I gained access to people who could advance my career in ways that military success alone never could. When I became first consul, I applied these lessons on a much larger scale. Instead of trying to rule France through force alone, I built a coalition of interests that made my success their success. I created the Legion of Honor to give ambitious men a stake in my regime. I negotiated the Concordat with the Catholic Church to secure the loyalty of religious conservatives. I established the Continental System to make European merchants dependent on French trade policies. Each of these alliances served multiple purposes. The Legion of Honor didn't just reward loyalty, it created a class of people whose status depended on my continued power. The Concordat didn't just end religious conflict, it made the Church a partner in maintaining social order. The Continental System didn't just damage British trade, it forced European rulers to choose between British commerce and French political protection. The most sophisticated alliance I ever constructed was my marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria. This wasn't a romantic decision. It was a calculated move to transform Austria from my greatest enemy into my most important ally. By marrying into the Habsburg family, I made any future war between France and Austria a civil conflict rather than a national one. The psychological effect was exactly what I had planned. Instead of fighting against a Corsican upstart who threatened the old order, Austrian nobles were now fighting against their own family member. The marriage didn't just create a military alliance, it created an identity crisis among my enemies that paralyzed their decision-making for years. But here's the crucial principle that most people miss about alliance building. Successful alliances are never based on friendship or shared values. They're based on mutual self-interest that's so clear and compelling that betrayal becomes self-destructive. When I allied with various German princes against Austria, I didn't appeal to their love of French culture or their admiration for my personality. I offered them territorial gains, elevated status, and protection from their enemies. I made supporting me the most profitable option available to them, and I made opposing me prohibitively expensive. The alliance system I built reached its peak during the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine. Instead of trying to directly rule 39 separate German states, I created a structure where local rulers maintained their authority while serving French strategic interests. Each prince had compelling reasons to support the system. They gained security, status, and territory, while the overall structure served my larger goals. This principle applies to every level of relationship building, whether you're building a career, launching a business, or pursuing any ambitious goal. Your success depends on making other people invested in your victory. You need to identify the key players who can help or hinder your progress, understand what they want most, and position yourself as the best path to achieving their goals. The art lies in creating win-win situations that feel natural rather than manipulative. People must believe they're choosing to support you because it serves their interests, not because you've trapped them into cooperation. The strongest alliances feel voluntary even when they're carefully engineered. My ultimate downfall came partly from forgetting this principle. When I became emperor, I gradually shifted from building alliances to demanding submission. I started believing that my military power was sufficient to maintain control without constantly maintaining the political relationships that had made that power possible in the first place. The lesson is clear. No matter how powerful you become, you're never powerful enough to succeed alone. Every achievement depends on other people choosing to help you rather than hinder you. The most successful people in history have always been master alliance builders who understood that individual brilliance means nothing without collective support. The sixth law that will make you unstoppable is this: what destroys weak people makes strong people stronger, but only if you learn to see every setback as raw material for your next breakthrough. I discovered this principle during the most humiliating moment of my early career. In 1788, I led an army to Egypt with dreams of conquering the Ottoman Empire and cutting British trade routes to India. The campaign began brilliantly. We captured Alexandria, defeated the Mameluke cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids, and established French control over Lower Egypt. Then Admiral Nelson destroyed my fleet at the Battle of the Nile, trapping my entire army in a hostile desert with no way home and no hope of reinforcement. In a single night, my glorious expedition became a potential catastrophe that could end my career and doom 35,000 French soldiers to death or slavery. My officers were devastated. Some talked of surrender, others of desperate attempts to break out through hostile territory. The rational response was despair. We were isolated, outnumbered, and facing enemies who knew the terrain better than we ever could. Every conventional military analysis suggested we were doomed. But sitting in my tent that night, studying maps by candlelight while listening to my men's worried conversations, I realized something that changed my entire approach to adversity. This disaster could become the greatest opportunity of my career if I was bold enough to reframe the situation entirely. Instead of seeing ourselves as trapped, I began thinking of our position as autonomous. Instead of viewing our isolation as weakness, I reconceptualized it as freedom from political interference. Instead of mourning our lost naval support, I focused on the fact that we now had complete liberty to pursue whatever strategy served our interests. The next morning, I called my staff together and announced that we weren't going to fight our way out of Egypt. We were going to make Egypt the launching pad for an empire that would span 3 continents. We would use our enforced isolation to build something that never could have been achieved under normal circumstances. What followed was one of the most audacious strategic pivots in military history. We began governing Egypt not as temporary occupiers, but as permanent rulers. We established hospitals, schools, and administrative systems. We recruited local scholars to help us understand Egyptian culture and history. We created alliances with tribal leaders who had been alienated by Ottoman rule. Most importantly, I used our isolation to conduct experiments in leadership and administration that would have been impossible under normal military command structure. Without interference from Paris politicians, I could test new approaches to governance, taxation, and social organization. Egypt became my laboratory for imperial management. The scientific expedition that accompanied our military force discovered the Rosetta Stone and laid the foundations for modern Egyptology. Our cartographers created the most accurate maps of the region ever produced. Our engineers designed irrigation systems that increased agricultural productivity. What had begun as a military disaster became a cultural and scientific triumph. When I finally returned to France, leaving my army under capable subordinate command, I brought back not just military experience, but a completely new model for how European power could be projected and maintained in foreign territories. The lessons I learned in Egypt directly informed every successful campaign that followed. But here's the deeper principle that this experience taught me. Setbacks become advantages only when you refuse to accept the conventional interpretation of what has happened to you. Most people allow external circumstances to define the meaning of their situation. They let other people's reactions determine their own emotional responses. The retreat from Moscow in 1812 provided an even more dramatic example of this principle. When winter and disease destroyed the Grande Armée, my enemies proclaimed that Napoleon was finished, that French power was broken, that the empire would collapse within months. They were looking at the same facts I was: hundreds of thousands of casualties, the loss of an entire army, the destruction of French prestige across Europe. But while they saw final defeat, I saw an opportunity to demonstrate that French resilience was greater than any single military disaster. I used the army's destruction as proof that France needed to mobilize every resource for total victory. The catastrophe justified measures that would have been politically impossible during peacetime. I could demand greater sacrifices, implement more radical policies, and concentrate more power, because the emergency was undeniably real. Within 6 months, I had raised new armies, negotiated new alliances, and launched campaigns that restored French dominance across Central Europe. What my enemies had interpreted as my death blow became the foundation for some of my greatest victories. The key is learning to ask different questions when disaster strikes. Instead of, "Why did this happen to me?" ask, "How can I use this?" Instead of, "What have I lost?" ask, "What have I gained?" Instead of, "How do I get back to where I was?" ask, "Where can this take me that I never could have gone before?" Every setback contains information that success cannot provide. Failure forces you to question assumptions you never examined during good times. Crisis reveals weaknesses in your systems that prosperity keeps hidden. Disaster eliminates options that were preventing you from discovering better alternatives. The people who become truly unstoppable are those who develop the mental discipline to immediately begin looking for advantages hidden within apparent disadvantages. They train themselves to see every setback as a puzzle to be solved rather than a tragedy to be mourned. This doesn't mean pretending that setbacks don't hurt or that losses aren't real. It means refusing to let temporary circumstances determine your permanent trajectory. It means maintaining the conviction that you can always find a way to transform what happened to you into fuel for what you're going to accomplish next. The 7th law that will make you unstoppable is understanding that victory belongs to those who know their opponents better than their opponents know themselves. Information is the ultimate weapon, and psychological intelligence is more valuable than any military advantage. I made studying my enemies into an obsession that bordered on mania. My headquarters maintained detailed files on every opposing general, every rival politician, and every potential threat to French interests. But this wasn't just collecting basic biographical information. I wanted to understand how these men thought, what motivated their decisions, and most importantly, what psychological weaknesses I could exploit. Before facing any opponent, I would study their previous campaigns with the intensity of a scholar analyzing ancient texts. I examined not just their tactical preferences and strategic patterns, but their decision-making under pressure, their relationships with subordinates, and their reactions to unexpected situations. General Mack, the Austrian commander I faced at Ulm in 1805, was a perfect example of how this psychological intelligence could be weaponized. My intelligence network had provided detailed reports on Mac's personality, his career disappointments, his relationships with other Austrian generals, and his desperate need to prove himself after previous failures. I learned that Mac was cautious by nature, but prone to overconfidence when he believed he held advantages. He was methodical in planning, but inflexible when plans went wrong. Most importantly, he was sensitive to criticism and tended to make emotional decisions when his competence was questioned. With this psychological profile, I designed a campaign specifically to exploit Mac's mental weaknesses. Instead of attacking his army directly, I maneuvered to make him feel foolish and outmaneuvered. I used rapid movements to create confusion about my intentions, then leaked false information that suggested I was making amateur mistakes. The result was exactly what I had predicted, based on his psychological profile. Mac became overconfident, made several tactical errors trying to exploit my apparent weaknesses, and ultimately trapped his entire army in an impossible position at Ulm. 30,000 Austrian soldiers surrendered without fighting a major battle, not because they were militarily defeated, but because their commander's psychology had been perfectly manipulated. Emperor Alexander of Russia required a completely different approach. My intelligence indicated that he was young, idealistic, and desperate to prove himself as a great military leader. Unlike Mac's caution, Alexander was prone to dramatic gestures and romantic notions about warfare. At Austerlitz, I deliberately made my position appear weak, and my army seemed smaller than it actually was. I even sent envoys to request a peace conference, knowing that Alexander's pride would interpret this as evidence of French desperation. Everything was calculated to appeal to his vanity and his desire for a glorious victory that would establish his reputation. When Alexander finally attacked, he did exactly what I had predicted a young, ambitious, and overconfident commander would do. He concentrated his forces against what appeared to be my weakest point, leaving his own center vulnerable to the devastating counterattack I had been preparing for weeks. But perhaps my most sophisticated psychological campaign was directed against the Duke of Wellington, my ultimate nemesis. Wellington was different from my previous opponents, disciplined, experienced, and largely immune to the emotional manipulation that had worked against others. Instead of trying to provoke Wellington into mistakes, I focused on undermining his strategic position through political and diplomatic pressure. I studied his relationships with his allies, his dependence on coalition warfare, and his need for political support from London. My campaign against Wellington was fought as much in European capitals as on European battlefields. The intelligence networks I built to support this psychological warfare were more extensive than any previous military commander had ever maintained. I had agents in every major European capital, contacts within opposing armies, and sources inside the most influential social circles. But the information itself was only half the equation. The real advantage came from my systematic analysis of how different personality types react under specific pressures. I developed detailed profiles of various leadership styles and learned to predict how different kinds of commanders would respond to particular tactical situations. Conservative generals like Archduke Charles could be defeated through rapid, unexpected movements that forced them to make decisions faster than their careful nature preferred. Aggressive commanders like Prince Bagration could be baited into overextending themselves by offering apparently vulnerable targets. Political generals could be manipulated through threats to their reputation and career prospects. This principle extends far beyond military applications. In every competitive situation, whether business, politics, or personal advancement, success depends on understanding the psychology of the people you're competing against. Most people focus exclusively on their own strengths and strategies, while remaining ignorant about their opponent's decision-making patterns. I made it my business to understand not just what my rivals were likely to do, but why they were likely to do it. I studied their career histories, their personal relationships, their financial pressures, and their psychological needs. This information allowed me to predict their behavior with remarkable accuracy and position my own moves for maximum effect. Key insight is that most people are far more predictable than they realize. They have consistent patterns of thinking, recurring emotional reactions, and standard responses to pressure. Once you understand these patterns, you can design strategies that virtually guarantee your opponents will react exactly as you want them to. Your competitors are giving you this information constantly through their public statements, their previous decisions, their social media activity, and their professional relationships. The question is whether you're disciplined enough to collect this intelligence systematically and analytical enough to transform it into strategic advantage. Victory belongs to those who understand that every competition is ultimately psychological, and every psychological contest is won by superior intelligence about human nature. The eighth law that will make you unstoppable is recognizing that reality is less important than perception, and the person who controls the story controls everything that follows. Your reputation is your most powerful weapon, and narrative is your most effective strategy. I understood this principle before the term public relations was ever invented. From my earliest campaigns, I recognized that military victories meant nothing if they weren't properly presented to the people who mattered. A brilliant tactical success that nobody heard about was worthless, while a modest achievement that was properly promoted could transform a career. During the Italian campaigns, I began writing my own dispatches to the Directory in Paris, crafting each report to create maximum political impact. I didn't just describe what happened. I shaped how it would be interpreted, what lessons would be drawn, and what expectations would be created for future operations. When I captured the bridge at Lodi, the tactical significance was limited. It was one small engagement in a larger campaign, but I presented it as a decisive moment that demonstrated French superiority over Austrian military science. I described the personal courage of individual soldiers, the precision of our artillery, and the speed of our victory in language that made readers feel they had witnessed something historic. More importantly, I made sure these reports reached not just government officials, but newspaper editors, salon hostesses, and influential social figures throughout Paris. I understood that public opinion would ultimately determine my political value, regardless of my military achievements. But controlling narrative isn't just about promoting your successes. It's about reframing your setbacks and neutralizing your opponent's advantages. When the British destroyed my fleet at the Battle of the Nile, leaving my army stranded in Egypt, I could have allowed this to be portrayed as a catastrophic defeat that ended my career. Instead, I immediately began crafting an alternative narrative. I presented our isolation not as a disaster, but as an opportunity for French civilization to take root in the ancient land of the pharaohs. I emphasized our scientific discoveries, our administrative innovations, and our cultural achievements rather than our military predicament. I commissioned scholars to write detailed accounts of our archaeological findings, our mapping expeditions, and our medical advances. I made sure that European newspapers received stories about French engineers improving Egyptian agriculture and French doctors treating diseases that had plagued the region for centuries. By the time I returned to France, the Egyptian expedition was remembered not as a military failure, but as a civilizing mission that demonstrated French cultural superiority. The narrative I had constructed transformed a potential career-ending disaster into evidence of my visionary leadership. The creation of Le Moniteur Universel as my personal propaganda organ was perhaps my most sophisticated application of narrative. Control. This wasn't just a government newspaper. It was a carefully designed instrument for shaping public opinion across Europe. Every article, every editorial, and every news report was crafted to support larger strategic objectives. When I wanted to justify the continental system, Le Moniteur published detailed articles about British commercial abuses and unfair trading practices. When I needed support for military campaigns, it featured stories about foreign threats to French security and the heroic sacrifices of our soldiers. When I sought to legitimize my imperial title, it carried historical analyses demonstrating the precedent for meritocratic rule, but the real genius was in making this propaganda feel natural and credible. I didn't just publish obvious political messages. I created a complete media environment that reinforced my preferred narrative through entertainment, cultural coverage, and seemingly objective news reporting. The bulletins from the Grande Armée during my major campaigns were masterpieces of narrative construction. Each bulletin was designed not just to inform, but to create specific emotional responses in specific audiences. Reports sent to Paris emphasized French victories and enemy weaknesses. Bulletins distributed among the troops focused on their heroism and the rightness of their cause. When circumstances forced me to report setbacks, I framed them as temporary obstacles that would ultimately strengthen our position. The famous 29th Bulletin, which finally acknowledged the disaster of the Russian campaign, was written to suggest that the Army's destruction was caused by exceptional weather rather than strategic failure, and that French resilience would quickly overcome this natural catastrophe. My marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria demonstrates how narrative control can transform political relationships. This wasn't just a diplomatic alliance. It was a carefully orchestrated public relations campaign designed to legitimize my dynasty and neutralize Austrian opposition. I made sure that every aspect of the courtship and wedding was presented as a romantic triumph that demonstrated the voluntary acceptance of French leadership by Europe's oldest ruling family. The Austrian princess wasn't being forced into marriage with an upstart Corsican. She was choosing to unite her ancient bloodline with the dynamic future represented by the French Empire. The key to effective narrative control is understanding that people don't respond to facts, they respond to stories. The same event can be presented as a triumph or a tragedy, as evidence of strength or proof of weakness, as the beginning of something great or the end of something important. Your job is to make sure that every significant event in your career is interpreted in ways that advance your larger objectives. This means thinking carefully about how you present your achievements, how you explain your setbacks, and how you position yourself relative to your competition. The most successful people in any field are master storytellers who understand that their reputation is built not on what actually happens to them, but on how what happens to them is perceived and remembered. They take personal responsibility for crafting the narrative of their own lives rather than allowing others to define their story. Control the story, and you control the outcome. Let others define your narrative, and you surrender the most powerful tool for shaping your own future. The ninth law that will make you unstoppable is understanding that a good decision executed quickly always beats a perfect decision that comes too late. Speed is the multiplier that transforms competence into dominance, and hesitation is the killer of more dreams than any external enemy. I learned this lesson during my first independent command in Italy, when I faced armies that outnumbered me nearly 2 to 1. The conventional wisdom was that I should wait for reinforcements, consolidate my position, and plan carefully before taking any significant action. My staff officers recommended weeks of preparation before attempting any major offensive, but I had studied my enemies closely enough to recognize that their greatest weakness was their inability to coordinate effectively. The Austrian and Piedmontese armies were operating under separate commands with different objectives and incompatible strategies. This advantage would disappear the moment they resolved their command issues or received orders from Vienna that unified their efforts. I had perhaps a 10-day window where enemy disorganization would allow inferior French forces to defeat them in detail. A perfect plan executed 3 weeks later would face unified opposition that perfect planning could never overcome. A flawed plan executed immediately would face divided enemies who couldn't effectively respond. I chose speed over perfection. Within 48 hours of taking command, I launched an offensive that separated the Austrian and Piedmontese armies and defeated each in succession. The battles of Montenotte, Millesimo, and Mondovì were won not through superior tactics, but through superior timing. By the time my enemies understood what was happening, the strategic situation had already been decided. The principle became fundamental to everything I accomplished afterward. At Ulm in 1805, I had perhaps 2 weeks before Russians. Reinforcements would join the Austrian army and create overwhelming numerical superiority. Instead of spending that time perfecting my battle plans, I spent it moving faster than any European army had ever moved before. My staff calculated that we needed to cover 180 miles in 7 days while maintaining combat readiness, something that military theory claimed was impossible. I told them that military theory would have to adapt to military necessity. We averaged over 25 miles per day across difficult terrain, arriving at Ulm before the Austrians had finished deploying their defensive positions. General Mack surrendered. His entire army because speed had made perfect Austrian defensive preparations irrelevant. While he was still organizing textbook defensive positions, I had already maneuvered behind him and made his fortress into a trap. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt provided an even more dramatic example. When I learned that the Prussian army was finally marching to confront me, I had to decide whether to wait for complete intelligence about their movements or to begin moving. Immediately based on incomplete information, waiting for perfect intelligence would have allowed the Prussians to choose the battlefield and timing that best served their advantages. Moving immediately on partial information meant accepting risks that more cautious commanders would never tolerate. I chose immediate action over perfect knowledge. The decision to march toward Jena before I knew exactly where the main Prussian army was located violated every principle of conventional military planning. My marshals argued that we could easily march into a trap or divide our forces in the face of superior enemy concentrations, but I understood that the Prussians were even more dependent on predictable planning than my own generals. They needed time to organize their complex command structure and coordinate their various corps. By forcing them to react to my movements instead of executing their preferred strategy, I was multiplying the effect of every advantage I possessed. The twin battles that followed destroyed Prussian military power in a single day, not because my tactical planning was perfect, but because my strategic timing was flawless. I had forced my enemies to fight before they were ready, in conditions they hadn't chosen, with coordination they hadn't perfected. This principle applies to every competitive situation, not just military campaigns. In negotiations, the person who makes the first reasonable offer usually gets better terms than the person who waits for perfect market information. In business, companies that launch good products quickly usually defeat competitors who spend years perfecting superior products that arrive too late. The key insight is that your competition is also planning, also preparing, and also trying to achieve perfect positioning. While you're perfecting your strategy, they're perfecting theirs. While you're gathering more information, they're gathering more resources. While you're waiting for ideal conditions, they're creating conditions that favor their success instead of yours. Speed disrupts everyone else's timeline and forces them to react to your choices rather than implementing their preferred strategies. When you move faster than your competition expects, you reveal information about their weaknesses while concealing information about your own intentions. But speed without direction is just chaos. The art lies in developing the judgment to recognize when you have enough information to act effectively, even if you don't have enough information to act perfectly. You need to distinguish between decisions that require extensive analysis and decisions that require immediate action. My rule was simple. Any decision that could be reversed or modified based on new information should be made as quickly as possible. Any decision that would be difficult to change required more careful consideration. Most decisions fall into the first category, but most people treat them as if they fall into the second. The 70% rule became my standard for decision-making under uncertainty. If I was 70% confident that a course of action would produce better results than inaction, I would act immediately and adjust based on results, rather than waiting for 90% confidence that might never come. Your competitors are paralyzed by the pursuit of perfect information and ideal conditions. They're waiting for certainty that will never arrive. While they're planning, you can be executing. While they're analyzing, you can be advancing. While they're perfecting, you can be conquering. Speed doesn't guarantee success, but it guarantees that you'll learn faster, adapt faster, and seize opportunities that cautious competitors will miss entirely. The 10th law that will make you unstoppable is this: the moment you accept your enemy's definition of the battlefield, you have already lost half the war. Victory belongs to those who change the rules rather than those who play by them perfectly. I discovered this principle during my campaigns against the Third Coalition, when every European power expected me to fight the same kind of war that had been waged for centuries. They prepared for traditional battles with traditional formations, using traditional strategies that had evolved over hundreds of years of aristocratic warfare. Instead, I gave them something they had never seen before and didn't know how to counter. While they were organizing elaborate siege operations and formal battle lines, I was pioneering rapid maneuver warfare that made their preparations irrelevant. While they were planning campaigns that would last entire seasons, I was achieving decisive results in a matter of weeks. The Battle of Austerlitz was the perfect example of refusing to fight the war my enemies wanted. The combined Austrian and Russian armies had chosen a defensive position on the Pratzen Heights that maximized their advantages in artillery, cavalry, and numerical superiority. Every conventional military analysis suggested I should either retreat or attempt to dislodge them through frontal assault. Both options would have played directly into their strengths. A retreat would have allowed them to dictate the timing and location of future engagements. A frontal assault would have wasted French lives attacking prepared positions defended by superior numbers. Instead, I created a third option that neither enemy had considered. I deliberately weakened my right flank and made it appear that I was planning to retreat. When the Allies descended from the heights to pursue what they believed was a defeated army, I struck their exposed center with forces they didn't know I possessed. The battle was decided not by superior fighting, but by superior thinking. I had changed the fundamental dynamic from a defensive engagement that favored my enemies to an offensive engagement that favored my strengths. But the most sophisticated example of changing the rules came during my campaign against the Fourth Coalition in 1806. The Prussians had built their entire military system around the tactical innovations of Frederick the Great, which had made them the most feared army in Europe for nearly 50 years. They expected me to engage them in the same style of warfare that had made Frederick famous: careful positioning, methodical maneuvering, and decisive battles between disciplined formations. Their entire strategic plan was based on the assumption that I would try to out-Frederick Frederick. Instead, I abandoned every convention of 18th century warfare and created something entirely new. I divided my army into independent corps that could operate separately but coordinate for overwhelming concentration at crucial moments. I used speed and flexibility to make Prussian precision and discipline into weaknesses rather than strengths. At Jena-Auerstedt, I didn't just defeat the Prussian army. I made their entire military philosophy obsolete in a single day. They had prepared for the war they knew how to fight, while I gave them a war they had never imagined. The continental system represented this principle applied to economic warfare. The British expected me to challenge their naval supremacy directly, building French fleets to contest British control of the seas. This would have been fighting the war Britain wanted, a naval competition that played to their greatest strengths. Instead, I attempted to turn Europe into an economic fortress that would strangle British commerce without requiring naval victories. I couldn't match British sea power, so I created a conflict where sea power became irrelevant. The system had its flaws, but it fundamentally changed the nature of the struggle between France and Britain. This principle extends far beyond military applications. In every competitive situation, your opponents are hoping you'll compete on their terms, using their preferred methods, fighting for objectives they've chosen. They've prepared for the competition they understand and built advantages around the rules they expect you to follow. When I was establishing the Civil Code, what became known as the Napoleonic Code, I faced opposition from legal scholars who wanted to maintain the complex, contradictory system of laws that had evolved over centuries. They prepared elaborate arguments defending traditional legal precedents and existing judicial procedures. I changed the rules by making simplicity and clarity the primary objectives, rather than historical precedent. Instead of trying to win a scholarly debate about legal theory, I created a practical legal system that ordinary citizens could understand and use. The opposition couldn't effectively argue against making laws more comprehensible. In my diplomatic negotiations, I consistently refused to follow the elaborate protocols and ceremonial procedures that other European courts expected. While they prepared for formal negotiations conducted according to traditional diplomatic etiquette, I offered direct personal communication that bypassed their preferred process entirely. The key insight is that most people invest enormous energy becoming excellent at playing games by existing rules. They develop expertise in established systems, master conventional strategies, and build advantages around traditional methods. This expertise becomes their weakness when someone changes the fundamental nature of the competition. Your competitors have spent years perfecting their approach to the current game. They've identified the key success factors, developed specialized skills, and positioned themselves to win according to existing rules. They're hoping you'll try to beat them at their own game, where their experience and preparation give them decisive advantages. Instead, you should be looking for ways to make their preparation irrelevant by changing what success looks like. You want to create conditions where their strengths become weaknesses and their advantages become liabilities. This doesn't mean being unpredictable for its own sake. It means being strategically innovative in ways that serve your larger objectives. You're not changing rules randomly. You're changing them to create competitive conditions that favor your particular combination of strengths and resources. The person who defines the nature of the competition usually wins the competition. The person who accepts someone else's definition of what they're competing for and how they're supposed to compete has already surrendered their most powerful strategic advantage. Never fight the war your enemy wants. Always fight the war you want, and make them adapt to your terms rather than adapting to theirs. Now, I must tell you something that the histories rarely mention and that most leaders refuse to acknowledge. Becoming truly unstoppable demands sacrifices that will cost you parts of yourself you can never recover. The laws I've shared will make you powerful, but power always extracts a price that only becomes clear when it's too late to change course. I speak to you from the perspective of someone who conquered most of Europe, commanded millions of men, and reshaped the political structure of an entire continent. But I also speak as someone who died alone on a remote island, estranged from his family, abandoned by his allies, and haunted by the knowledge that my relentless pursuit of greatness had cost me everything that makes life meaningful. The first price you'll pay is intimacy. As you become unstoppable, you'll discover that genuine relationships become almost impossible to maintain. People will approach you because of what you can do for them, not because of who you are. You'll find yourself constantly evaluating whether someone's friendship is real or strategic, whether their loyalty is personal or professional. My marriage to Josephine began as a love affair, but gradually transformed into a political alliance. Every conversation became filtered through considerations of dynastic importance, diplomatic consequences, and public perception. The woman I had loved passionately became someone I consulted strategically. We were never again simply husband and wife. We were emperor and empress, and the roles consumed the people we had once been. When I divorced Josephine to marry Marie-Louise of Austria, I told myself it was necessary for the empire, essential for securing the dynasty, crucial for European stability. All of this was true, but it was also a choice that sacrificed personal happiness for political advantage. I gained an alliance with Austria and lost the only woman who had loved me before I became Napoleon. The second price is trust. The more unstoppable you become, the more dangerous you appear to everyone around you. Your success creates fear in your competitors, suspicion among your allies, and anxiety in your subordinates. People begin to see you as a threat that must be contained rather than a leader to be supported. I spent my later years surrounded by men who served me faithfully but never forgot that I possessed the power to destroy them. My marshals obeyed my orders not out of loyalty but out of recognition that disobedience meant exile or death. My ministers implemented my policies not because they believed in them, but because disagreement was career suicide. The loneliness of absolute power is something that cannot be understood until you've experienced it. You make decisions that affect millions of lives, but you make them alone because no one else shares the burden of ultimate responsibility. You have advisors, but their advice is colored by their knowledge that you hold their futures in your hands. The third price is perspective. When you become accustomed to achieving the impossible, you gradually lose the ability to recognize what is actually possible. Success becomes addictive, and each victory demands a greater victory to provide the same satisfaction. You start taking risks that would have horrified your younger, more cautious self. The invasion of Russia was the perfect example of this psychological trap. By 1812, I had defeated every European power, reorganized the continent according to my will, and established French dominance from Madrid to Warsaw. Any rational analysis suggested that this was enough, that consolidating these gains was more important than pursuing additional conquests. But unstoppable momentum has its own logic. I had become psychologically incapable of accepting limitations that would have satisfied any other ruler in history. The very qualities that had made me successful, ambition, confidence, willingness to take enormous risks, had evolved into qualities that made restraint impossible. The fourth price is empathy. The daily exercise of power over others gradually erodes your ability to see situations from their perspective. You become accustomed to being obeyed, to having your needs prioritized, to viewing other people primarily in terms of their usefulness to your objectives. Remember a moment during the retreat from Moscow when I passed a group of wounded soldiers who had been left behind because they couldn't keep up with the army's desperate pace. 20 years earlier, the young artillery officer from Corsica would have been devastated by their suffering. But the emperor who had commanded millions simply noted their location and continued marching. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was gradual and almost imperceptible. Each decision to prioritize strategic objectives over individual welfare made the next such decision easier. Each choice to value results over relationships made empathy feel like a luxury I couldn't afford. The final price is peace. When you become truly unstoppable, you lose the ability to simply be content with what you have. Every achievement becomes the foundation for the next ambition. Every success creates new possibilities that demand to be pursued. You become trapped in a cycle of perpetual striving that prevents you from ever enjoying what you've accomplished. Never learned to be satisfied with ruling France or with dominating Western Europe or even with reshaping the entire continental balance of power. Each triumph only revealed new horizons that needed to be conquered. Rest felt like stagnation, contentment felt like decline, and peace felt like defeat. Even now, in exile on this forgotten island, I find myself planning campaigns I'll never fight and dreaming of victories I'll never achieve. The mind that learned to be unstoppable never learned to stop. I share these painful truths not to discourage you from pursuing greatness, but to ensure you understand what you're choosing. The laws I've taught you will indeed make you unstoppable, but they will also change you in ways that you cannot currently imagine. The person who achieves ultimate success will not be the same person who began the journey. Let me tell you about the day when everything I had built, everything I had learned, and everything I believed about being unstoppable was tested against the immovable reality of human limitation. June 18, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo, was not just my military defeat. It was the moment when the laws that had made me emperor proved insufficient against forces I had failed to understand. I had returned from Elba with absolute confidence that my mastery of warfare and politics would restore French dominance within months. The 100 days began exactly as I had predicted. The soldiers flocked to my eagles, the people celebrated my return, and Europe trembled at the news that Napoleon was once again on the march. But something had changed during my exile, something I was too proud to acknowledge and too experienced to recognize. The Europe I faced in 1815 was not the Europe I had conquered repeatedly between 1805 and 1809. My enemies had learned from their defeats, adapted their strategies, and most importantly, developed the patience to coordinate their efforts in ways that had previously been impossible. When I met Wellington's army at Waterloo, I was facing not just a British general, but the culmination of 20 years of European military evolution specifically designed to neutralize the advantages that had made me unstoppable. Wellington had studied every battle I had ever fought, and had positioned his forces to minimize every tactical innovation I had pioneered. The morning of the battle, I made decisions based on patterns that had succeeded countless times before. I delayed the attack to allow the ground to dry, confident that my artillery would create the same devastating effects that had shattered enemy lines from Austerlitz to Wagram. I positioned my troops according to formations that had never failed to achieve breakthrough success. But I was fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's assumptions against an enemy who had prepared specifically for my preferred methods. Wellington's reverse slope positioning neutralized my artillery advantage. His mixed formations of British, Dutch, and German troops created tactical complexity that my standardized assault techniques couldn't penetrate. Most crucially, I had become a victim of my own success. For 20 years, European armies had retreated, repositioned, or collapsed when faced with French pressure. I had developed an instinctive expectation that sustained attack would eventually break any defensive line. At Waterloo, I encountered an army that simply refused to break, regardless of the pressure applied. The psychological shock of facing troops who absorbed punishment without yielding was something I hadn't experienced since my earliest campaigns in Italy. I found myself repeating attacks that weren't working, escalating commitments that weren't succeeding, and applying increasing force to achieve results that greater force could not deliver. My decision to send the Imperial Guard in a final assault was the decision of a general who could not accept that unstoppable force had met truly immovable object. I had never before encountered a situation where my best troops, using my most proven tactics against an enemy I understood thoroughly, could achieve nothing but their own destruction. The Guard had never retreated from any battlefield in their history. Their advance had broken the resistance of every European army they had ever faced. When they fell back from the British squares in confusion and disorder, something broke in the French army that went beyond mere tactical defeat. But the real lesson of Waterloo wasn't military, it was psychological. I had become so accustomed to achieving impossible results through superior will and tactical innovation that I had lost the ability to recognize when circumstances had fundamentally changed. The very confidence that had enabled my greatest victories became the blindness that prevented me from adapting to new realities. I had committed the cardinal sin of fighting the battle I wanted to fight rather than the battle that the situation required. I applied methods that had worked in different circumstances against different enemies at different times, assuming that superior execution could overcome incompatible strategic conditions. The afternoon of Waterloo, watching my Imperial Guard retreat for the first time in their history, I experienced something that 20 years of victory had not prepared me for: the recognition that even perfect application of proven principles can fail when those principles no longer match reality. Wellington later said that Waterloo was the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life, and he was correct. The battle could have been won by better weather, different timing, or the arrival of reinforcements 30 minutes earlier, but it could also have been avoided entirely by a commander wise enough to recognize that some battles should not be fought. My defeat at Waterloo was not the result of tactical incompetence or strategic blindness. It was the inevitable consequence of unstoppable ambition, meeting the fundamental truth that no individual, regardless of talent or will, can indefinitely overcome the combined opposition of everyone else. The lesson is not that the laws of becoming unstoppable don't work. They work precisely as I have described them. The lesson is that even perfect mastery of these laws cannot overcome the ultimate limitation that faces every ambitious person. The world will eventually organize itself to contain your success. The irony is that my greatest strength, my inability to accept defeat or limitation, became the weakness that made final defeat inevitable. I could not adapt to a world where being Napoleon was no longer enough, where the very fame and fear that had been my greatest assets had become liabilities that united every potential enemy against me. Waterloo taught me that becoming unstoppable is only the beginning of the challenge. The real test is learning to remain effective when everyone else has learned to stop you. Here on St. Helena, stripped of armies and empire, surrounded by nothing but ocean and British guards, I have finally learned lessons that 20 years of victory could never teach. In this enforced stillness, where every day stretches like an eternity and every sunset marks another step toward obscurity, I have discovered truths about power, ambition, and human nature that only defeat can reveal. The first lesson of exile is that genuine power cannot be taken away by circumstances. The British may have captured my body, but they cannot imprison the mind that revolutionized Europe or the ideas that will outlive every one of my captors. Physical power, armies, territories, titles, can be lost in a single battle. But intellectual power, the ability to see patterns and possibilities that others miss, remains untouchable. I spend my days now dictating memoirs, not out of vanity, but because I recognize that my true empire was never geographical. It was the transformation of human thinking about what was possible. The codes of law I established, the administrative systems I created, the meritocratic principles I championed, these will influence human society long after the last persons alive remembers the specific battles I won or lost. The second lesson is that sustainable achievement requires building institutions stronger than any individual personality. My empire collapsed not because I was defeated, but because I had made myself indispensable to its functioning. When Napoleon fell, everything that depended solely on Napoleon's presence fell with him. If I could live my career again, I would spend less time commanding personally and more time developing systems that could operate effectively without my constant supervision. I would delegate not just tactical execution, but strategic thinking. I would create multiple centers of competence instead of concentrating all critical functions around my own decision-making. The great irony is that my micromanagement, which felt like strength, was actually weakness disguised as control. By insisting on personal involvement in every important decision, I created fragility rather than resilience. The Roman Empire survived for centuries after Augustus because he built institutions. My empire died with me because I never learned to make myself dispensable. The third lesson is that true legacy comes from what you enable others to accomplish, not what you accomplish yourself. History will remember Napoleon Bonaparte as a conqueror, but the changes that matter most, the spread of legal equality, the merit-based advancement, the destruction of feudal privileges, these were achieved by millions of people who used the opportunities I created to transform their own lives. My proudest achievement is not Austerlitz or Jena, but the fact that common soldiers could become marshals of France based on courage and competence rather than bloodline. The young men who rose through my armies carried these expectations into civilian life, creating a permanent change in how European society evaluated human worth. The fourth lesson is that isolation is the enemy of judgment. Power tends to surround you with people who tell you what you want to hear rather than what you need to know. The higher you rise, the more difficult it becomes to receive honest feedback about your decisions or accurate information about their consequences. Here in exile, paradoxically, I have access to perspectives that were impossible when I commanded an empire. My British captors have no reason to flatter me. My few remaining servants speak honestly about my weaknesses, and my own memory is no longer clouded by the need to justify immediate decisions. I realize now that many of my worst strategic errors, particularly the invasion of Russia, were the result of receiving information that had been filtered through multiple layers of people who were afraid to contradict my existing beliefs. The intelligence that reached me told me what my subordinates thought I wanted to hear, not what I needed to know. The fifth lesson is that contentment is a skill that must be learned consciously, because achievement alone will never provide it. I spent my career assuming that the next victory, the next conquest, the next political triumph would finally bring satisfaction. Instead, each success merely revealed new possibilities that demanded pursuit. I never learned to enjoy what I had accomplished because I was always focused on what I hadn't yet achieved. Even at the height of my power, ruling most of Europe and commanding millions of men, I felt incomplete because Britain remained unconquered, Russia remained defiant, and complete universal dominance remained elusive. Now, with nothing left to conquer and nowhere left to advance, I have finally discovered the peace that comes from accepting limitation. It is a bitter irony that exile has provided the satisfaction that empire never could. The final lesson is that death gives meaning to life by imposing the ultimate constraint on ambition. Knowing that my time is finite forces me to consider what actually matters beyond immediate success. What do I want to be remembered for? What principles do I want to pass to future generations? What mistakes do I want others to avoid? These questions were invisible when I believed I could achieve anything and had unlimited time to achieve it. Mortality provides the perspective that a mortal ambition cannot offer. I would not trade my extraordinary life for an ordinary one, even knowing the price I paid for greatness. But I would advise anyone who chooses the path of unstoppable ambition to periodically remember that you are still human, that your time is limited, and that some of life's most important satisfactions cannot be conquered. They can only be received now. That you understand the 10 laws and their consequences. Let me show you how to apply this imperial wisdom to build your own empire in today's world. The battlefield has changed from 19th century Europe to 21st century markets, but human nature remains constant, and the principles that created empires then will create success now. First, recognize that your career is your campaign, and every day presents tactical decisions that will determine your strategic position. Just as I studied terrain before every battle, You must understand the landscape of your industry, the positions of your competitors, and the resources available for your advancement. Map your professional environment. With the same intensity, I mapped European geography. Begin by identifying your equivalent of the Italian campaign, the opportunity that could establish your reputation and create momentum for everything that follows. This might be a challenging project that others are avoiding, a failing department that needs restructuring, or an emerging market that established players don't yet understand. Apply the first law. Seize this opportunity like your life depends on it, because your career trajectory absolutely does. Implement the second law through preparation that borders on obsession. In my era, this meant studying maps and weather patterns. In your era, it means understanding data analytics, market trends, customer psychology, and technological disruptions that others ignore. Become the person who knows more about your field than anyone else, not just in your company, but in your entire industry. Practice the third law by leading from the front in every situation where leadership is needed. Volunteer for the difficult assignments, be visible during crises, and share the risks rather than just distributing them. Whether you're managing a team or working as an individual contributor, make sure people see you taking personal responsibility for outcomes rather than hiding behind process or hierarchy. Apply the fourth law by developing strategic patience in your career development. Don't accept the first promotion offered or jump at every opportunity that appears. Wait for the positions that align with your larger objectives, even if this means turning down immediate advantages. Build your reputation methodically rather than chasing quick wins that don't advance your long-term position. Implement the fifth law by building alliances systematically across your organization and industry. Identify the people who will be influential in 5 to 10 years, not just those who are powerful today. Invest in relationships before you need them, and always ensure that supporting your success serves other people's interests as well as your own. Practice the sixth law by reframing every setback as strategic intelligence. When projects fail, analyze what you learned about organizational dynamics. When you're passed over for promotion, study what actually drives advancement decisions. When market conditions change, examine how successful people adapt. Turn every disappointment into data that improves your next attempt. Apply the seventh law by studying your competition with the intensity I studied enemy generals. Understand not just what your competitors do, but why they do it, what motivates their decisions, and what psychological patterns govern their behavior. Use this intelligence to position yourself advantageously rather than simply trying to outwork them. Implement the eighth law by taking control of your professional narrative. Don't let others define your reputation or frame your achievements. Communicate your successes strategically, present your setbacks as learning experiences, and position yourself as the solution to problems that matter to decision makers. Your story is your most powerful weapon. Practice the ninth law by developing a bias toward action in your decision-making. When opportunities appear, act quickly to secure them before others realize their value. When problems arise, address them immediately before they compound. Speed of execution beats perfection of planning in most competitive situations. Apply the 10th law by refusing to compete on other people's terms. Instead of trying to be better at what everyone else is doing, create new categories where your unique combination of skills provides unbeatable advantages. Change the definition of success in your field rather than accepting existing definitions. But remember the lessons of my exile. Build systems that don't depend entirely on your personal involvement. Develop other people who can execute your vision. Create value that survives personnel changes. Focus on sustainable competitive advantages rather than just immediate victories. Most importantly, maintain perspective about what you're actually trying to achieve. Professional success should enhance your life, not consume it entirely. The goal is to become unstoppable in service of objectives that matter, not to become unstoppable for its own sake. Start tomorrow by choosing one of these laws and implementing it systematically for 30 days. Don't try to transform everything at once. Even I conquered Europe one country at a time. Build momentum through consistent application of these principles until they become automatic responses rather than conscious strategies. Your empire awaits. The question is whether you have the wisdom to build it better than I built mine. As the sun sets over St. Helena for what may be the final time I'll witness, I want to leave you with the most important truth I've learned from a lifetime of conquest and defeat. Becoming unstoppable is not about eliminating all obstacles from your path. It's about transforming yourself into the kind of person who creates new paths when the old ones are blocked. You now possess the same laws that elevated me from a minor Corsican noble to Emperor of the French. These principles are not mere theory. They are battle-tested strategies that have shaped the destiny of nations and the lives of millions. But knowledge without application is worthless, and application without wisdom is dangerous. Tatatify, a challenge. You personally to begin this transformation immediately, not tomorrow, not next week, not when conditions become more favorable. Today, right now. Choose the opportunity that others are avoiding and seize it like your future depends on it, because it does. Begin preparing for challenges you cannot yet see, but know are coming. Start building alliances with people who will matter in the future, not just those who matter today. Lead from the front in whatever capacity you currently occupy, whether you're commanding armies or answering emails. But learn from my mistakes as well as my victories. Remember that sustainable success requires building something larger than yourself. Create systems that don't depend on your constant involvement. Develop other people who can carry your vision forward. Build institutions that will outlast your personal leadership. Most importantly, never lose sight of why you chose to become unstoppable in the first place. Power is not an end. It's a means to accomplish something meaningful. Conquest is not success. It's opportunity to create lasting value. Your unstoppable nature should serve purposes beyond your own advancement. The world needs people who refuse to accept limitations, who see possibilities others miss, who create solutions when conventional wisdom offers only problems. But it needs these people to be wise as well as ambitious, strategic as well as determined, humane as well as powerful. 200 years after my death, people still study my campaigns, implement my legal codes, and apply principles I discovered through triumph and tragedy. Not because I was perfect, but because I proved that extraordinary achievement is possible for anyone willing to pay the price and learn the lessons. Your century offers opportunities that make my European empire look small by comparison. Global communication, unlimited information, technological tools that can amplify individual capability beyond anything I could imagine. The same laws that made me emperor can make you unstoppable in ways that surpass anything I accomplished. But remember, always that you are responsible not just for what you achieve, but for how you achieve it and what you leave behind. Build your empire in a way that enhances rather than diminishes the people around you. Use your unstoppable nature to create value that extends beyond your personal success. The greatest emperors are not remembered for the territories they conquered, but for the principles they established and the possibilities they created for future generations. Your empire should make the world better, not just make you more powerful. As I prepare for my final campaign, the one that every mortal must fight alone, I am confident that these laws will outlive both of us. They are not Napoleon's laws. They are human laws that happen to have been discovered and tested by someone history chose to call Napoleon. Make them your laws now. Apply them with wisdom I sometimes lacked. Tempered by humility, I learned too late. Guided by purposes larger than personal glory. Your unstoppable future begins the moment you choose to stop waiting for permission and start creating the reality you want to inhabit. Go build your empire. Make it worthy of the price you'll pay to create it. The emperor has spoken. The rest is up to you.